The taste of pulverized concrete and copper blood coated Marcus's tongue. He was not a hero, he was not a god, nor a super soldier, nor a billionaire in a flying suit of armor. Marcus was simply a maintenance engineer for the Avengers compound, a man whose entire world had just been obliterated by a rain of hellfire from a warship the size of a city. Pinned beneath a massive steel girder, his ribs screaming in agony with every shallow breath, Marcus could only turn his head an inch to the right. Through the jagged cage of twisted metal and smoking debris, he bore witness to the end of the world. The sky was an apocalyptic bruised purple, choked with ash. A few hundred yards away, the mightiest protectors of Earth were falling. He watched, paralyzed by a cold, hollow terror, as a giant with skin the color of a fresh bruise brought a massive double-bladed sword down upon the shield of Captain America. The unbreakable metal shattered. The sound was a sickening crack that vibrated in Marcus's jaw. Thor was down. Iron Man was bleeding out, and behind the mad titan Thanos, a black sea of teeth, claws, and alien armor stretched to the horizon. This was the end. But what if the darkest moment in human history was violently interrupted, not by a calculated heroic sacrifice, but by the most chaotic, unimaginable forces of a completely different reality? Fear is a primal thing. It strips away logic. As Marcus lay bleeding in the ruins of the only life he knew, he watched the alien commander raise his blade to signal the final slaughter. The horde of outriders gnashed their jaws, a million mechanical shrieks piercing the suffocating air. The massive warship, Sanctuary 2, loomed overhead, casting a shadow that swallowed the broken battlefield. Marcus closed his eyes, a silent prayer dying on his lips. His entire life, his belief system, had been defined by a simple, terrifying truth. Ordinary humans were nothing but grass beneath the feet of warring gods. The Avengers had tried to protect them, but the universe was simply too cruel, too vast, and too hungry. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable rush of monsters to tear through the rubble and end his suffering. He braced for the sound of roaring beasts. Instead, what he heard was the sound of the universe tearing like wet paper. It was not the thunderous boom of the Asgardian Bifrost, nor the sparkling, crackling hum of a sorcerer's portal. It was a high-pitched harmonic screech that made Marcus's teeth ache and his eardrums throb. He forced his eyes open just in time to see the bruised sky directly above the battlefield fracture. It did not open. It shattered like a pane of glass struck by a sledgehammer. A blinding prismatic cube of multicolored light violently punched its way through the gray clouds, trembling with unstable, catastrophic energy. The sheer atmospheric pressure of its arrival flattened the smoke and blew away the fires burning around the compound. Then the cube cracked open. Two small silhouettes tumbled out, screaming not in terror, but in what sounded terrifyingly like excitement. They plummeted from the sky at a speed that ignited the air around them, striking the earth directly between the battered Captain America and the towering Thanos. The impact hit like a tactical nuclear strike. The shockwave threw chunks of earth and shattered armor hundreds of feet into the air. Marcus gasped as the concussive force rattled his steel cage, sending a fresh wave of dust over his face. When the smoke finally began to clear, revealing two deep, smoldering craters in the bedrock of the facility, Marcus felt his heart drop into his stomach. Through the haze, he didn't see new gods. He didn't see cosmic saviors. He saw two children. One wore a bright orange martial arts uniform, his messy black hair defying gravity. The other had lavender hair and wore a green tunic, aggressively brushing dirt off his shoulders. They looked no older than 12. Marcus felt a sickening surge of horror. The universe had not sent salvation. It had sent two innocent boys to be butchered. The boys looked around, completely unfazed by the apocalyptic hellscape. The one with black hair blinked his massive, innocent eyes, looking directly at the blood-soaked Captain America. He said something, but Marcus couldn't hear the words over the ambient roar of the alien army. Thanos, insulted by this bizarre intrusion, did not hesitate. The Mad Titan narrowed his eyes and thrust his blade forward. The command was silent, but the response was deafening. A vanguard of 300 outriders, 6 armed beasts of pure muscle and malice, broke from the alien ranks. They surged forward on all fours, a tidal wave of black flesh designed to rip apart steel and bone. Marcus tried to scream, tried to warn the children to run, but his throat only produced a wet rattle. He watched the monsters close the distance in seconds. The boys didn't run. They didn't even take fighting stances. They just looked at each other and grinned. The lavender-haired boy sighed, crossing his arms, while the black-haired boy simply took a single step forward. What happened next broke Marcus's mind. There was no magic, no high-tech weaponry, just motion. Motion so violently fast that the human eye could not process it. A shockwave of pure, invisible force erupted from the black-haired child as he threw a single, casual punch into the empty air. The concussive blast hit the charging outriders like an invisible freight train moving at the speed of light. Dozens of the alien beasts were instantly vaporized into black mist. The rest were launched backward so violently they shattered the armor of the troops standing behind them. The lavender-haired boy raised a single hand, his fingers glowing with an intense, blinding yellow light. With a flick of his wrist, a sphere of energy no larger than a baseball shot into the center of the alien army. The resulting explosion turned the sky white. The heat washed over Marcus's face, smelling of ozone and burning ozone. When the light faded, a crater the size of a football stadium had been carved into the center of Thanos's invincible army. Thousands of aliens were simply gone, erased. Marcus stared, his breath completely stopped. His reality was broken. The paralyzing dread of inevitable death had been instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sweeping shock. He did not know what these small creatures were, but they were not children. They were walking cataclysms. And as Thanos stood frozen, his eyes wide as he realized his absolute dominance had just been completely shattered by 2 laughing boys, Marcus knew this war was no longer about Earth's survival. It was about what happened when the unstoppable force of the cosmos met something entirely beyond the rules of creation. The silence that followed the blinding flash was heavier than the noise of the battle. Marcus coughed, spitting a mixture of ash and his own blood onto the cracked concrete beneath his twisted steel cage. His ears rang with a high, sustained whine, the aftermath of the concussive force that had just vaporized a battalion of alien nightmares. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the stinging dust from his eyes, his mind desperately clawing for a rational explanation. There was none. A few yards away, Captain America had managed to push himself up onto one knee. The super soldier, a man who had stared down gods and monsters without flinching, was frozen. His jaw was slack, his dirt-smeared face locked in an expression of absolute, paralyzing disbelief. He was looking at the 2 small boys standing amidst the smoking craters, completely unscathed. The black-haired child, the one in the bright orange dye, was currently floating. He wasn't jumping, he wasn't using thrusters like Tony Stark. He was simply suspended in the air, legs kicking idly as if sitting on an invisible swing. Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. His previous terror, the fear of being crushed by alien beasts, was rapidly mutating into something far more profound. It was the terrifying realization that humanity, the Avengers, and even the Mad Titan Thanos were merely insects crawling on the floor of a much larger, much more dangerous universe. High above the shattered remnants of the Avengers compound, a squadron of Chitauri chariots broke formation. Screeching like mechanical vultures, they banked sharply, their energy cannons glowing a toxic purple as they locked onto the 2 hovering anomalies. Marcus wanted to scream a warning. He wanted to tell the boys to take cover, but before his lungs could draw breath, the boy in the orange guy giggled. It was a bright, echoing sound that cut through the grim atmosphere of the battlefield like a silver bell. The child pointed a single tiny finger toward the descending armada. He didn't shout a spell, he didn't charge a weapon, he merely made a soft pew sound with his lips. A barrage of golden needle-like beams erupted from his fingertip. They moved so fast they left permanent afterimages burning on Marcus's retinas. The golden light stitched across the sky in a chaotic, beautiful, and utterly lethal geometry. The Chitauri chariots didn't just explode, they were cleanly pierced, their heavy armor offering as much resistance as wet tissue paper. Dozens of ships detonated simultaneously, raining molten scrap metal and burning alien flesh down upon the battlefield. The boy in the green tunic, still standing on the ground, sighed loudly and kicked a pebble, muttering something about his friend showing off. A shadow fell over them. Thanos, the conqueror of worlds, the being who had physically battered the Hulk into submission and broken the mind of the universe, was vibrating with a rage so dense it seemed to warp the air around him. Marcus watched the Titan's face contort. This was not the calculated philosophical warlord who had snapped his fingers and erased half of all life. This was a proud, supreme predator whose absolute authority had just been mocked by toddlers. Thanos let out a roar that shook the remaining foundations of the compound. He gripped his massive, double-bladed weapon with both hands and charged. The ground quaked beneath his heavy boots, each step cracking the bedrock. He was aiming for the boy in the green tunic. Despite everything he had just witnessed, human instinct surged within Marcus. They were just kids. No matter what kind of light they could shoot from their hands, the sheer physical mass of the charging Titan was akin to a falling meteor. Marcus braced himself for the sickening sound of a child being crushed. Thanos brought the blade down with enough kinetic force to cleave a mountain in half. The heavy metal whistled, parting the ash-filled air. Then the sky tore open for the second time. It wasn't a crack this time, it was a flawless vertical pillar of iridescent prismatic light that slammed into the earth directly between Thanos and the boy. The heavy double-bladed sword struck the boundary of the light and bounced back with a massive metallic clang, the shockwave vibrating so violently that Thanos was forced to take a staggering step backward. His golden armor sparked, the kinetic energy of his own blow rebounding into his arms. The pillar of light hummed with a celestial frequency, a sound so pure and alien that the very dust in the air seemed to freeze in place. As the radiant beam slowly dissipated, fading into glittering motes of cosmic energy, 3 new figures were left standing on the battlefield. Marcus felt all the oxygen leave his lungs. If the children had broken his understanding of reality, these newcomers shattered it into a million unrecoverable pieces. One was a tall, incredibly slender being with pale blue skin and stark white hair, holding a long staff topped with a floating black orb. He looked entirely undisturbed by the apocalypse raging around them, his posture carrying the elegant, relaxed grace of a nobleman taking a stroll in a private garden. But it was the 2 men flanking him that caused Marcus's chest to tighten until it hurt. They looked human, or at least humanoid, with wild, spiky dark hair and muscular builds, but they did not feel human. Marcus couldn't explain it. It wasn't something he saw. It was something he felt in the marrow of his bones. The sheer atmospheric pressure around the 2 men was crushing. It was as if the gravity in their immediate vicinity had suddenly multiplied tenfold. The air itself seemed to shimmer and warp, bowing to the sheer density of the invisible energy radiating from their bodies. One man wore a blue and yellow armor suit. His arms crossed over his chest, his face twisted in a scowl of pure, concentrated fury. The other wore an orange uniform identical to the floating child, his expression remarkably relaxed, almost bewildered. The man in the armor did not look at Thanos. He did not look at the alien army. He marched straight up to the boy in the green tunic and began shouting. The volume and intensity of his voice carried across the silent battlefield. He barked about irresponsibility, about the absolute stupidity of manipulating internal ki inside a dimensional transit warp, and how they could have been scattered across the temporal void forever. He was a father furious with a disobedient son. The man in orange, meanwhile, rubbed the back of his neck, laughing a deep, nervous chuckle. He drifted upward, gently resting a hand on the head of the boy who had just vaporized the Chitauri fleet. The man complained loudly, his voice carrying a whining, almost comical tone, stating that his stomach was empty and that his wife was going to murder him if they were late for dinner again. Marcus watched this bizarre domestic dispute play out in the center of the most catastrophic war in Earth's history. He looked at Captain America, who was slowly lowering his broken shield, his eyes darting between the bickering men and the paralyzed alien horde. Thanos stood frozen. For the first time since he had arrived on this planet, the Mad Titan looked unsure. His calculating mind was desperately trying to process the threat level of these beings who completely ignored him. He could feel it too. Every instinct in Thanos' warlord biology was screaming at him that the two bickering men were walking extinction events. Humiliation and survival instinct clashed within the Titan. Unable to comprehend the overwhelming power disparity, Thanos defaulted to his ultimate failsafe. He took a heavy step back, raising his golden gauntlet toward the sky. He roared a command in his guttural native tongue, pointing his heavy blade directly at the arguing fathers. High above, the massive engines of Sanctuary 2 groaned. The warship, dwarfing the clouds themselves, slowly rotated its primary weapons batteries downward. Thousands of heavy plasma cannons began to hum, glowing with an intense, fiery red light that painted the ash-choked sky in the color of fresh blood. Marcus felt the heat radiating from the atmosphere before the first shot was even fired. His heart hammered against his bruised ribs like a trapped bird. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The children had been a chaotic distraction, but this was the end. Thanos was going to burn the entire grid to ash. He didn't care about his own troops anymore. He only cared about wiping these terrifying anomalies from existence. The Avengers were completely exposed, exhausted, and broken on the field. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut as the sky ignited. Thousands of superheated plasma bolts, each one capable of leveling a city block, detached from the warship and began their descent, raining down like a localized apocalypse. There was nowhere to hide. The steel girder pinning Marcus would melt in seconds. He was going to burn. The cost of this bizarre cosmic intrusion was finally being collected, and the price was everything that remained of the Earth's resistance. The sky roared, a deafening waterfall of fire, and Marcus braced for the agonizing heat of total annihilation. The sky did not simply burn, it screamed. 1,000,000 tons of displaced atmosphere roared as the vanguard of Thanos' plasma barrage broke through the lower clouds. For Marcus, trapped beneath the crushing weight of the twisted steel girder, the end of the world tasted like copper and smelled of melting ozone. The heat radiating from the descending death was absolute, a suffocating blanket that instantly blistered the exposed skin on his face and arms. This was not a localized explosion. It was an extinction-level curtain of fire, painted in the darkest, most terrifying shades of crimson. Through the narrow, jagged gaps of his metal prison, Marcus watched the final moments of Earth's greatest defenders. He saw the silhouettes of the broken heroes illuminated by the bloody light of their own impending demise. Captain America, battered and bleeding, did not run. He slowly, agonizingly, raised his shattered shield over his head, a gesture of pure, heartbreaking futility, against a storm that would vaporize concrete, steel, and bone alike. Marcus closed his eyes, his tears boiling away before they could even trace down his dirt-caked cheeks. The fear was gone, replaced by a hollow, ringing acceptance. The gods of this universe were cruel, and the cost of defying them was total annihilation. But the crushing weight of the apocalypse never arrived. Instead of the deafening roar of superheated plasma impacting the Earth, Marcus heard a sound that belonged to a different reality entirely. It was a sharp, irritable click of a tongue. He opened his eyes, the blinding red glare of the falling fire casting long, dancing shadows across the battlefield. The man in the blue and yellow armor, the one who had just been scolding his child with the mundane frustration of a tired father, had stopped talking. He stood with his back to the falling death, his spiky hair casting a harsh silhouette. He did not look terrified. He did not look heroic. He looked profoundly, venomously annoyed. The man slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the colossal warship sanctuary, two hovering in the stratosphere. He let out a low, breathy scoff that somehow, impossibly, carried over the screeching descent of the plasma bolts. Then the gravity of the entire battlefield died. Marcus gasped, his lungs suddenly expanding as the crushing atmospheric pressure was violently inverted. Loose pebbles, shattered glass, and pools of spilled blood began to slowly levitate, defying the laws of physics. The air itself grew thick, vibrating with a low, bass-heavy hum that rattled the marrow in Marcus's bones. It wasn't magic. It wasn't the sparkling, intricate geometry of the sorcerers. It was raw, unfiltered, screaming power. The man in the armor raised a single, white-gloved hand toward the burning sky. He didn't shout an incantation. He didn't brace himself. He simply gathered the latent energy of the cosmos into his palm. A pinpoint of vibrant, pulsing violet light ignited at the center of his hand. In the span of a microsecond, that pinpoint expanded into a swirling, jagged sphere of purple electricity. The light it cast was cold, alien, and utterly dominant, drowning out the crimson glare of Thanos' falling barrage. The ground beneath the man's boots instantly vaporized, turning into a perfectly smooth crater of molten glass simply from the proximity of the energy. The man thrust his palm forward. The word he spoke was low, guttural, and carried the weight of a dying star. A beam of pure, concentrated violet destruction erupted from his hand. To Marcus, it did not look like an attack. It looked like the man had just unzipped the fabric of reality itself. The Gallic gun did not travel through the air. It violently displaced it, creating a vacuum that dragged the clouds, the smoke, and the very screams of the alien horde into its slipstream. The beam, wider than the entire Avengers compound, collided with the descending curtain of crimson plasma. There was no explosion. There was no struggle for dominance. The purple light simply swallowed the red fire whole. It consumed the artillery strike, erasing thousands of plasma bolts from existence in absolute silence. Marcus watched, his jaw unhinged, his mind completely fracturing as the beam punched a hole straight through the atmosphere. The violent violet light struck the underbelly of Sanctuary 2, the invincible flagship of the Mad Titan, a vessel that had subjugated 1,000 worlds. The thick, reinforced alien armor did not bend or break. It instantly transitioned from solid to gas. The beam cored through the massive ship in a fraction of a second, erupting out the top and continuing its journeys into the infinite void of deep space. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, the battlefield was plunged into absolute, deafening silence. The purple light vanished, leaving only an afterimage burned so deeply into Marcus's vision that he saw it every time he blinked. High above, the impossible happened. The colossal warship, a floating mountain of iron and malice, hung suspended in the bruised sky with a perfectly circular, glowing hole punched clean through its center. Then the structural integrity failed. The internal fusion reactors detonated. A silent blossom of blue and white fire tore the rear half of the ship apart. The shockwave hit the ground 3 seconds later, a wall of kinetic force that flattened the remaining Outriders and sent Captain America skidding backward across the dirt. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut as his steel cage rattled violently, the screeching metal threatening to give way and crush him. When he dared to look again, the sky was raining liquid fire. Thanos, the unstoppable force of the universe, dropped to one knee. The Mad Titan stared up at the sky, his eyes wide, his jaw trembling. His invincible armada, his ultimate weapon, was gone, erased by a single gesture from an angry father. But as the awe washed over Marcus, a new, chilling realization clawed its way into his chest. The ship was destroyed, yes, but its mass remained. Millions of tons of superheated, jagged alien metal were now plummeting toward the Earth, a meteor shower of catastrophic proportions born from the Saiyan's careless display of power. The threat of the plasma was gone, but the consequence of the intervention was a descending storm of molten shrapnel that threatened to bury the Avengers, the alien horde, and Marcus himself. He realized then, with a profound, terrifying clarity, that surviving the wrath of a god meant nothing when you were caught in the wake of a monster. The sky was falling, and the men who broke it were already turning their backs. The sky above the ruined Avengers compound was no longer a battlefield. It was a collapsing ceiling of liquid fire. Millions of tons of alien alloy, the eviscerated remains of Thanos' flagship, were plummeting toward the Earth. For Marcus, the apocalypse had simply changed its shape. The heat radiating from the descending debris was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, instantly evaporating the sweat and blood on his skin. Through the twisted steel of his cage, he watched the jagged shadows of the falling wreckage grow larger, swallowing the ambient light. The air itself began to scream, a deafening metallic screech of atmospheric friction tearing the massive hull fragments apart. It was a localized extinction event. The man in the blue armor had neutralized the plasma strike, only to replace it with a meteor shower of catastrophic proportions. And the invaders, the impossible gods who had just shattered the invincible alien armada, were completely ignoring it. They were arguing. Marcus could feel the skin on his forearms beginning to blister. The steel girder pinning him down was acting like a heat sink, rapidly absorbing the thermal radiation from the burning sky. His breathing became shallow, ragged gasps of oxygen-starved air. A few yards away, Captain America remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the largest piece of descending wreckage, a section of the ship's primary thruster engine, the size of a skyscraper, falling directly toward the center of the compound. Beneath its shadow lay the unconscious, bleeding form of Tony Stark. The golden red armor was battered and lifeless, completely exposed to the impending impact. Steve Rogers tried to push himself forward, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, but his leg was shattered. He couldn't reach Stark in time. Nobody could. The realization hit Marcus with the cold, paralyzing weight of absolute certainty. The heroes were going to die, crushed under the weight of an alien warship, all because two bickering fathers from another dimension didn't understand the concept of collateral damage. Fear is a paralytic, but despair is a catalyst. Marcus was not a soldier. He possessed no super serum, no magic, no billions of dollars. He was a man who fixed ventilation shafts and calibrated hydraulic doors. But as he watched the billionaire genius about to be flattened into the dirt, a profound, irrational defiance flared within his chest. He refused to let the world end like this, as a forgotten footnote in a domestic dispute between cosmic anomalies. His right arm was free, pinned at an awkward angle, his fingers resting near a heavy, solid steel pipe wrench that had spilled from his tool belt during the initial bombardment. Marcus ignored the agonizing pain in his fractured ribs. He wrapped his bleeding fingers around the knurled handle of the wrench. He didn't have the strength to throw it at the falling debris. He didn't have the leverage to strike the girder pinning him, but he had just enough rotational angle to swing it backward, aiming for the hollow, resonant titanium plating of a destroyed StarkTech generator adjacent to his prison. With every ounce of desperate, terrified energy left in his human body, Marcus swung the wrench. The impact produced a sharp, piercing, high-decibel clang. The sound cut through the low-frequency rumble of the falling wreckage and the chaotic roaring of the alien horde. It was a perfectly mundane, perfectly human noise, the sound of a mechanic hitting a pipe. It was completely out of place in a war of gods. Marcus didn't stop. He swung again and again, screaming with raw, tearing vocal cords, not forming words, just projecting pure, concentrated human desperation into the burning air. The noise echoed across the shattered crater. For a fraction of a second, the battlefield froze. Captain America turned his head, his eyes widening in confusion. Thanos, still recovering from the shockwave, instinctively braced for another attack. But the most important reaction came from the man in the orange martial arts uniform. The man had been in the middle of laughing, his hand resting on the back of his head, when the first metallic clang reached his ears. His laughter stopped instantly. The goofy, relaxed posture evaporated, replaced by a sudden, razor-sharp stillness. He didn't turn his head, he simply disappeared. There was no blur of motion, no gust of wind. One microsecond he was standing 50 yards away, and the next he was crouching directly in front of Marcus's twisted steel cage. The sudden displacement of air popped Marcus's eardrums. Up close, the man didn't look like a god. He looked intensely, vibrantly alive. His spiky black hair defied gravity, and his dark eyes were impossibly wide, carrying an expression of mild curiosity rather than divine authority. He looked at the heavy steel girder pinning Marcus's chest, then looked up at the skyscraper-sized thruster engine plummeting toward Tony Stark. "Wow," the man said, his voice carrying a surprisingly deep, resonant timbre that seemed to vibrate in Marcus's sternum. "That's a big piece of metal. You'd definitely get squished by that." He didn't sound panicked. He sounded like a man observing a large raindrop. Before Marcus could form a word of warning, the man reached out with a single, calloused index finger and tapped the underside of the 10-ton steel girder, pinning Marcus to the ground. There was a sharp, shrieking groan of protesting metal. The girder, along with the concrete slab attached to it, was instantly flipped backward, soaring hundreds of feet into the air as if it weighed nothing more than a piece of cardboard. Marcus gasped, his chest suddenly expanding. The crushing weight removed so violently, he felt momentarily weightless. He scrambled backward, his broken legs dragging uselessly in the dirt, his eyes wide with a terror that completely eclipsed his previous fear of Thanos. The man in orange stood up, casually wiping his hands on his pants. He tilted his head back, staring directly into the blinding glare of the falling apocalypse. "Hey, Vegeta," he yelled, cupping a hand around his mouth. The sound of his voice effortlessly drowned out the screeching atmosphere. "You made a mess. If Chi-Chi finds out we let a planet get crushed because you got mad at a spaceship, she's gonna kill me." From across the battlefield, the man in the blue armor simply scoffed, a sound of profound arrogance, and crossed his arms tighter, refusing to acknowledge the falling debris. The orange-clad man sighed, a heavy, dramatic sound of a father tasked with doing the household chores. He widened his stance, planting his dark boots firmly into the shattered earth. He drew his hands back to his right hip, bringing his wrists together, his fingers curled inward like a blossoming lotus flower. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous and terrifying. The ambient temperature, already boiling from the falling wreckage, suddenly plummeted. All the loose dust, ash, and pebbles within a 100-yard radius stopped falling and began to spiral inward, drawn toward the man's cupped hands by an immense, localized gravitational pull. A point of piercing, ethereal blue light ignited between his palms. It was not fire, it was not plasma. It was a concentration of pure, living energy that hummed with a frequency that made Marcus's teeth ache and his vision blur. The sound it produced was a high, singing whine, like a choir of tuning forks vibrating on the edge of a shattered glass pane. The man's muscles swelled, his orange uniform rippling violently despite the absence of any natural wind. The sheer kinetic pressure radiating from his body forced Marcus to press himself flat against the cracked concrete, unable to even lift his head. "Cut me!" The man's voice echoed, no longer whining or casual. It was layered, resonating with a booming tectonic authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The blue light intensified, expanding into a swirling sphere of blinding azure energy. The shadows on the battlefield warped, stretched by the impossible luminance. Captain America shielded his eyes, turning away from the sheer intensity of the glow. Even Thanos, the Mad Titan, took an involuntary step backward, raising his heavy, golden-armored arm to protect his face from the blinding radiation. "Ah, me." The man leaned forward, his aura flaring outward in a violent, chaotic burst of translucent, white energy that cracked the ground beneath him into a spiderweb of deep fissures. The falling thruster engine was less than 1,000 feet away now, its massive bulk dominating the entire sky, the heat of its re-entry threatening to ignite the oxygen in the air.
Ha!
The man thrust his hands forward. The blue sphere did not explode. It unleashed a sustained, roaring river of sapphire destruction. The beam was massive, a pillar of pure kinetic light that surged upward with a concussive boom that completely shattered every remaining pane of glass. Within a 5-mile radius, Marcus screamed, his hands clamped over his ears, but the sound bypassed his eardrums and vibrated directly through his skull. The blue beam struck the falling skyscraper-sized engine dead center. The alien metal didn't shatter. It didn't break apart into smaller, deadlier pieces. It was instantly, utterly atomized. The intense kinetic friction of the energy wave dissolved the titanium alloy at a molecular level, turning millions of tons of lethal shrapnel into a harmless, glowing mist of vaporized iron. The beam continued its upward trajectory, sweeping across the bruised sky, erasing every last piece of the falling warship in a brilliant, blinding wash of azure light. But power of that magnitude does not exist without consequence. The beam had vaporized the debris, but the sheer thermal backwash and concussive displacement of air created a localized hurricane of hyper-compressed atmospheric pressure. The shockwave radiated outward from the epicenter of the blast, a visible rippling wall of distorted air. It slammed into the ground with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. Marcus was instantly lifted from the dirt, his body thrown backward like a rag doll. He slammed violently into the reinforced concrete base of a destroyed watchtower, the breath exploding from his lungs in a spray of blood. Across the field, the shockwave swept over the alien horde, tossing hundreds of heavy outriders into the air, breaking their lines and shattering their assault formation. But the wind didn't stop there. It tore through the ruins of the Avengers compound, the underground bunker, the last remaining structural safe haven that housed the emergency medical supplies, the communication relays, and the triage center for the wounded staff, took the full force of the displaced air. The heavy steel doors groaned, buckled, and then violently imploded. The reinforced concrete walls of the bunker, weakened by the initial orbital bombardment, completely collapsed inward under the sheer pressure of the Saiyan's collateral wind. Marcus watched through blurred, bloodshot eyes as the roof of the bunker caved in, burying the entire medical wing beneath thousands of tons of unmovable rubble. A cloud of thick gray dust plumed into the air, marking the grave of their last remaining lifeline. The threat from the sky had been erased, but the sanctuary on the ground had been entirely annihilated. As the blinding blue light faded and the artificial hurricane died down to a heavy, choking breeze, Marcus lay slumped against the broken concrete, his body completely numb. His desperate choice to swing the wrench had drawn the god's attention, saving Tony Stark from being crushed. He had altered the fate of a superhero. But as he stared at the collapsed remains of the medical bunker, a profound, chilling emptiness washed over him. The permanent cost of this survival was visceral and undeniable. All their medical supplies, their communication gear, and their last secure fallback point were permanently destroyed, reduced to dust, not by the villain, but by the careless backwash of their savior. Marcus's worldview had permanently shifted. The terrifying reality was that humanity wasn't just grass to be trampled by warring gods. They were dust, easily blown away by a savior simply clearing his throat. The immediate threat of the debris was gone, but the Avengers were now completely exposed, devoid of any shelter or supplies, trapped on a devastated battlefield with a furious surviving Titan making the imminent final clash an unavoidable nightmare. The ringing in Marcus's ears shifted from a high-pitched metallic whine to a low rhythmic thumping that synced perfectly with his violently racing heart. The air was a suffocating soup of pulverized concrete, vaporized alien metal, and the coppery stench of fresh blood. He lay slumped against the jagged remnants of a watchtower, his lower body numb, his chest screaming with every agonizing expansion of his lungs. Less than 50 yards away, the smoking crater that used to be the Avengers' underground medical bunker stood as a silent, devastating monument to the collateral damage of gods. Marcus knew with a sickening, heavy certainty that at least 40 field medics, communications officers, and critically wounded staff were buried beneath those thousands of tons of unmovable rubble. They had survived the initial orbital bombardment. They had survived the terrifying ground assault of the alien horde, but they had not survived the sheer, thoughtless backwash of their savior's power. A shadow moved through the thick, settling dust. Thanos, the mad titan, pulled himself up from the shattered earth. His golden armor was scarred and blackened, the pristine polish entirely stripped away by the sheer kinetic friction of the Saiyan's energy beam. The conqueror of worlds looked up at the empty sky, where his invincible flagship, Sanctuary II, had dominated the atmosphere just moments ago. The absolute silence of the upper atmosphere was more deafening than any explosion. Thanos did not scream, he did not roar in blind fury. Instead, his broad, bruised face twisted into a mask of cold, calculated malice. He gripped the hilt of his massive, double-bladed sword, the heavy metal scraping against the stone with a sound like a sharpening executioner's axe. He realized instantly that his overwhelming tactical advantage was gone, but he also realized something far more dangerous. The beings who had destroyed his fleet were completely ignoring him. The tall, pale entity with the floating staff, the one called Whis, tapped the base of his rod gently against the glass-smooth crater floor. The sound was a pure harmonic chime that effortlessly sliced through the ambient groans of the dying battlefield. The chime resonated with a terrifying, absolute authority that made Marcus's teeth ache. "The dimensional rift has been stabilized, my lords," Whis spoke, his voice carrying the calm, melodic cadence of a polite butler, informing his masters that tea was ready. "We have already lingered far beyond the permissible threshold. To remain here, to further alter the fabric of this localized reality, is a direct violation of divine law. We must depart immediately. The fate of these mortals is entirely their own to decide." Whis turned his calm, unblinking eyes toward the bickering Saiyans, his posture entirely relaxed, but conveying an unyielding cosmic finality. Goku, the man in the bright orange guy, stopped adjusting his belt and looked across the devastated battlefield. His dark eyes fell upon the broken forms of the Avengers. Captain America was struggling to stand, his shattered shield hanging uselessly from a fractured arm. Iron Man lay motionless in the dirt, the arc reactor on his chest flickering with a dim, dying light. Thor, the god of thunder, was slumped against a piece of wreckage, barely conscious. They were the absolute pinnacle of human resistance, and they were completely, utterly broken. Goku's expression softened, the casual, goofy demeanor vanishing in an instant. A deep, heavy conflict shadowed his face. His core instinct, his very nature as a martial artist, was to protect the weak and fight for justice. But the divine law was absolute. To intervene meant breaking the cardinal rule of his existence alongside the deities. Thanos did not wait for the cosmic tourists to make up their minds. The Mad Titan raised his heavy blade, pointing it directly at the heart of the fallen Avengers. A guttural, terrifying command erupted from his throat, a language that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. From the fringes of the smoke, the surviving remnants of his elite vanguard, the heaviest, most heavily armored shock troops of the Chitauri and the Black Order, surged forward. They were not a mindless horde. They were a precision strike force, moving with terrifying speed and synchronized malice. Their target was not the Saiyans. Their target was Captain America and the helpless, unconscious body of Tony Stark. Thanos knew he could not defeat the anomalies, but he could still complete his primary objective, the total extermination of Earth's leadership. The massive beasts roared, their heavy metallic boots shaking the ground, closing the distance in seconds. Marcus watched the incoming slaughter from his paralyzed position in the dirt, his breath hitched in his throat. He tried to scream, tried to warn the broken heroes, but his voice was completely gone. He looked back at the Saiyans. Goku was clenching his fists, his muscles trembling as he fought the urge to step forward. He was bound by a rule of cosmic non-interference, a moral code dictated by the angels. But it was the man in the blue armor, Vegeta, who made the irreversible choice. Vegeta had spent his entire life governed by a ruthless, unyielding pride. He fought for glory, for dominance, for the thrill of battle against worthy opponents. He did not care for the weak. He did not play the savior. But as he watched the alien vanguard charging toward the helpless humans, something snapped within the Saiyan prince. It was not compassion. It was a violent, overwhelming disgust at the cowardice of slaughtering the defenseless. "To hell with your divine laws, Whis," Vegeta snarled, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the hair on Marcus's arms stand on end. "I refuse to let a bruised giant execute cripples while I stand here and watch like a coward." Vegeta did not power up. He did not scream or surround himself with a blinding aura of energy. He simply raised his right hand, his fingers curled into a rigid, claw-like grip. He locked his gaze onto the charging alien vanguard. But Vegeta knew the terrifying truth of his own power. If he fired a standard energy blast to eradicate the shock troops, the resulting explosion would completely vaporize the surviving Avengers and crack the Earth's crust. He needed a heat sink. He needed a physical mass dense enough to absorb the catastrophic kinetic force of a localized energy detonation. And his cold, tactical mind instantly calculated the only viable option on the battlefield. With a brutal downward sweep of his arm, Vegeta manipulated the localized gravity field around the charging alien elite. The shock troops didn't just stumble, they were violently dragged through the air, their trajectories forcefully altered by an invisible, inescapable tractor beam. Marcus watched in absolute horror as the entire heavy vanguard, hundreds of tons of armored muscle and alien weaponry, was hurled directly into the collapsed ruins of the medical bunker. The impact was deafening, a sickening crunch of metal and stone as the aliens were piled into the deep, unstable crater. But Vegeta wasn't finished. Before the aliens could even attempt to climb out of the rubble, the Saiyan prince extended two fingers, unleashing a razor-thin, highly compressed beam of golden energy straight into the heart of the crater. The moral rule of the hero is to find another way, to save everyone. But Vegeta was not a traditional hero. He made the ruthless utilitarian calculation that Goku could not make. The golden beam struck the center of the collapsed bunker, igniting a contained subterranean explosion. The ground heaved violently, cracking open like a dry riverbed. A column of searing golden fire erupted from the crater, incinerating the entire alien vanguard in a fraction of a second. But the Earth did not absorb all the force. The ruins of the bunker acted as an oven. The intense thermal radiation and concussive pressure instantly, undeniably, completely vaporized whatever remained of the trapped medical staff inside. For a single agonizing second, before the blast completely consumed the area, Marcus heard it. It wasn't the roar of the explosion. It was the sharp, collective human scream of the people trapped below, entirely cut short by the blinding light of their salvation. The heat washed over Marcus, singeing his eyebrows and blistering his skin, but the physical pain was entirely dwarfed by the absolute crushing horror of what he had just witnessed. The threat to the Avengers was gone. Captain America and Tony Stark were perfectly safe, shielded from the blast by the distance and the subterranean containment. but the cost was visceral and permanent. Vegeta had deliberately chosen to use the graves of innocent, trapped humans as a blast shield to execute the enemy. He had saved the heroes, but he had actively, knowingly sacrificed the weak to do it. There was no clean right or wrong answer in the smoking crater. The heavy metallic stench of vaporized alien armor was now irrevocably mixed with the sickening, undeniable scent of burned human flesh. Marcus stared at the smoking, glowing crater, his worldview completely shattered. His before belief that humans were simply collateral damage in the wars of gods had mutated into something far more terrifying. The gods were not just careless, they were capable of cold, calculated sacrifice. He was no longer just a terrified bystander waiting to be crushed. He was a witness to the profound, unforgivable math of survival. The innocence of hoping for a clean rescue was gone forever, replaced by the grim realization that every miracle came with a butcher's bill. Across the battlefield, Thanos stood entirely alone. His army was completely decimated, his fleet erased. But the Mad Titan did not retreat. He reached down into the dirt, his massive fingers closing around a glowing metallic object that had been dislodged during the chaos. The situation had permanently escalated. The alien warlord had nothing left to lose, and the cosmic visitors had just proven they were willing to cross any moral line. The final bloody clash was now utterly unavoidable. The metallic stench of vaporized alien armor did not mask the underlying sickening odor of the incinerated medical bunker. It hung in the stagnant air, a heavy, suffocating reminder of the butcher's bill exacted by their alien savior. Marcus lay paralyzed in the dirt, his bleeding fingers still curled around the heavy steel pipe wrench. He did not blink. He could not look away from the glowing subterranean oven where dozens of human lives had just been violently traded for the safety of two superheroes. His chest heaved with ragged, wet breaths, every inhalation scraping against his fractured ribs. The absolute terror of being crushed by falling debris had been entirely replaced by a cold, hollow, vibrating shock. The universe was not just indifferent, it was governed by an arithmetic of survival so ruthless that it shattered the very concept of heroism. Marcus stared at the man in the blue armor, the one called Vegeta, who stood with his arms still outstretched, his face completely devoid of regret. The Saiyan prince had done the math, executed the equation, and saved the kings by burning the pawns. Through the dense, swirling curtain of gray dust and purple smoke, a massive silhouette began to rise. Thanos, the Mad Titan, pulled himself up from the shattered bedrock. His golden armor was scorched black, the intricate alien metallurgy pitted and warped by the sheer kinetic backwash of the Saiyan's energy beams. He was entirely alone. His invincible armada was a fading memory of vaporized ash in the upper atmosphere. His elite vanguard, the most terrifying shock troops in the cosmos, were currently acting as the fuel for Vegeta's subterranean furnace. But Thanos did not look like a defeated warlord. He did not project the frantic panic of a commander who had lost his army. As the smoke parted, Marcus saw the Titan's massive, calloused hand gripping something in the dirt. It was a chaotic tangle of red and gold nanotech, torn from the arm of a fallen Avenger during the initial melee. It was Tony Stark's desperate improvised gauntlet, and nestled within its crushed metallic housing, 6 points of concentrated infinity pulsed with a terrifying, rhythmic heartbeat. Marcus recognized the device immediately. He had spent months routing the secure fiber optic lines for the compound's temporal laboratory, watching the Avengers desperately construct that very gauntlet on the security feeds. It was the absolute focal point of the entire war. The realization hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow, driving the remaining breath from his lungs. Thanos did not need his army. He did not need his warship. If the Mad Titan secured the stones, the destruction of the fleet and the sacrifice of the bunker were utterly meaningless. The universe would not just burn, it would be rewritten. Thanos ripped the twisted red and gold metal apart with a sickening crunch. He discarded the casing, his thick fingers carefully extracting the largest, most volatile gem, the Power Stone. It glowed with a violent, unstable purple luminescence that immediately cast long, jagged shadows across the battlefield, drowning out the ambient light of the burning sky. Thanos did not attempt to wield the broken gauntlet. With a guttural, roaring scream that rattled the shattered concrete around Marcus, the Titan slammed the raw, uncontained Power Stone directly into the center of his own chest plate. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The purple energy did not merely surround him, it violently invaded his biology. Veins of blinding violet light exploded across the Titan's purple skin, crawling up his neck and illuminating his eyes with a terrifying hollow glare. The ambient gravity around him collapsed. Boulders, shattered weapons, and the broken bodies of his own soldiers began to float upward, disintegrating into fine purple dust before they even reached his waist. The sound of the stone was a low, mechanical bass drop that vibrated so intensely it caused the blood vessels in Marcus's nose to burst. Thanos was no longer a warlord. He had mutated into a walking, localized singularity of pure, unfiltered destruction. High above the crater, the tall, pale entity known as Whis gracefully tapped his staff against the invisible fabric of the air. The sound was a sharp, crystalline chime that momentarily cut through the roaring bass of the Power Stone. "The localized reality is fracturing," Whis stated, his melodic voice carrying a terrifying urgency. "The mortal has bonded with a foundational fragment of this universe's creation matrix. To engage him now would require a release of divine energy that will permanently shatter this dimensional plane. We have overstayed our anomaly window. We must depart immediately or risk the erasure of both our timeline and theirs." Whis turned his calm gaze toward the two Saiyans. The dimensional rift behind him, a swirling vortex of prismatic light, began to pulse and hum, actively pulling at the edges of their clothing, eager to drag them back to their own reality. Goku, the man in the orange uniform, did not look at the portal. He was staring at the glowing, smoking crater where the medical bunker used to be. His fists were clenched so tightly that droplets of blood fell from his knuckles, his relaxed, goofy demeanor entirely eradicated. He slowly turned his head to look at Vegeta, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, overwhelming fury. "You killed them," Goku whispered, his voice dangerously low, entirely devoid of its usual warmth. "They were completely defenseless, Vegeta. You used them as a shield. That wasn't a fight. That was a slaughter." Vegeta met Goku's furious gaze without flinching, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute defiance. "I saved your precious heroes, Kakarot," Vegeta snarled, his voice dripping with venomous pragmatism. "I made the choice you were too cowardly to make. The giant is executing them, and you are worrying about collateral damage in a dimension that isn't even ours. Do not preach to me about the cost of war while the universe burns around you." The moral debate of the gods echoed across the battlefield, but to Marcus, the words were meaningless static. He lay bleeding in the dirt, his eyes fixed on the supercharged Titan. Thanos raised his arms, his entire body trembling under the catastrophic strain of the Power Stone. The ground beneath his heavy boots liquefied, turning into a bubbling lake of purple glass. He locked his glowing eyes onto the unconscious forms of Captain America and Tony Stark. With a sweeping, brutal motion, Thanos unleashed a tidal wave of pure, concentrated annihilation. It was not a beam of energy. It was a physical wall of violet destruction, 50 feet high, erasing the very oxygen from the air as it surged forward. It did not burn the ground, it unmade it. The wave roared across the battlefield, consuming debris, corpses, and steel, leaving absolutely nothing in its wake. It was heading directly for the fallen heroes, moving with the terrifying inevitability of a collapsing star. Marcus's entire body screamed in agony, every nerve ending begging him to remain perfectly still. He was a broken mechanic, a forgotten casualty lying in the dust. but the profound, terrifying realization he had experienced at the bunker crystallized into a singular, undeniable choice. He refused to be grass. He refused to be a passive observer to the brutal math of the universe. If the gods were willing to sacrifice the weak, then the weak had to choose their own deaths. With a guttural, tearing cry, Marcus dug his bleeding fingers into the cracked concrete. Ignoring the blinding pain of his shattered legs, he dragged his upper body across the jagged debris. He tore his fingernails to the quick, leaving a thick trail of blood across the ash. He was not fast enough to outrun the wave. He was not strong enough to stop it, but he was just close enough to the unconscious form of Tony Stark. As the blinding, roaring purple wave of annihilation closed the final distance, casting a shadow of absolute death over the remaining Avengers, Marcus threw his broken body forward. He collapsed heavily over the lifeless golden-red chestplate of Tony Stark, wrapping his arms around the billionaire's shoulders. It was a pathetic, entirely human shield, flesh and bone against the infinite power of creation. Marcus closed his eyes, squeezing them shut against the blinding violet glare, and waited for the searing pain of complete molecular disintegration. He fully accepted the butcher's bill. He had seen the cost of miracles, and he was offering himself as the final payment. The roaring sound of the wave became deafening, vibrating through his skull, threatening to tear his mind apart before the energy even touched his skin. But the disintegration never came. Instead, the ambient temperature plummeted to absolute zero. The roaring base of the Power Stone was violently interrupted by a sound like a million panes of glass shattering simultaneously. Marcus opened his eyes. Less than 3 feet away from his face, a wall of translucent, ethereal blue fire had erupted from the earth. The purple wave of annihilation slammed into the blue barrier with a concussive boom that stopped Marcus's heart for a full second. Through the blinding clash of light, Marcus saw a silhouette standing directly between them and the Titan. It was Goku, but the orange uniform was now glowing with an intense, divine light, and his spiky black hair had transformed into a brilliant, radiant Saiyan. The aura surrounding the Saiyan was completely different from before. It was calm, absolute, and impossibly dense, pushing back against the raw, chaotic fury of the Power Stone. Goku had his hands thrust forward, his palms flat against the surging wall of purple death. The muscles in his arms strained, bulging with the impossible effort of holding back the fundamental energy of the universe. "Go!" Goku roared over his shoulder, his voice echoing with a booming, dual-layered resonance that sounded like two gods speaking in perfect unison. "I can't hold the laws of this universe forever. Get them out of here!" The ground beneath Goku's boots cracked and splintered, unable to handle the sheer, opposing pressures of Divine Ki and the Infinity Stone. The clash of the two catastrophic forces created a localized storm of lightning, tearing deep fissures into the earth and completely rewriting the magnetic field of the crater. Thanos screamed in defiance, pushing more of the lethal purple energy from his chest, desperately trying to crush the anomaly that dared to defy the stones. The struggle lasted for only 5 agonizing seconds, but it permanently scarred the landscape. With a final explosive shout, Goku flared his divine aura outward, releasing a concussive shockwave of blue light that violently repelled the purple wave. The resulting detonation threw Thanos hundreds of feet backward, his heavy armor skipping across the molten glass like a stone on water. Goku instantly dropped his arms, the cyan light vanishing as he gasped for air, his body reverting to its normal state. The physical toll of directly opposing an Infinity Stone without destroying the planet had drained him. Before Thanos could recover, Whis tapped his staff one final time. The swirling, prismatic vortex of the dimensional rift surged forward, instantly enveloping Goku, Vegeta, and the 2 children. In a blinding flash of multicolored light, the cosmic anomalies were gone, completely erasing their crushing atmospheric pressure from the battlefield. Marcus lay gasping on top of Tony Stark's armor, his entire body trembling violently. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than the noise of the battle. The air was thick, choked with the smell of ozone, blood, and the devastating realization of what had just transpired. The immediate threat of the purple wave was gone, but the Mad Titan was already pulling himself out of the molten trench, his eyes burning with a psychotic, unrestrained rage. The true heroes of Earth were still broken, the medical staff was permanently buried, and the Saiyans had vanished into the ether. But as Marcus stared at the approaching supercharged warlord, a new sound began to hum behind him. It was a soft, crackling spark of golden energy. Marcus slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes widening. Directly behind the battered, struggling form of Captain America, the dark, ash-choked air began to tear open, tracing a massive, glowing, circular portal of golden magic. The ultimate clash could no longer be avoided, but the humans would have to face it with the terrifying knowledge that they were entirely on their own. The air behind Captain America did not simply ignite, it began to sing. It was a frequency completely different from the terrifying, bone-rattling hum of the Saiyan's blue energy or the sickening bass drop of Thanos' raw power stone. This sound was warm, resonant, and deeply ancient. Marcus lay draped over the cold, lifeless armor of Tony Stark, his bloodied fingers still desperately clutching the steel pipe wrench. He slowly lifted his chin, his neck screaming in protest, to look at the space directly behind the battered super soldier. A single, solitary spark of golden light flickered in the suffocating gray ash. It hung there for a fraction of a second, entirely fragile, before it began to trace a perfect burning circle in the fabric of reality. The golden magic crackled with the sound of a roaring hearth fire, pushing back the oppressive metallic chill left behind by the cosmic anomalies. For the first time since the sky had fallen, Marcus did not feel the crushing weight of an indifferent universe. He felt the sudden, undeniable gravity of human magic. The portal expanded violently, throwing brilliant orange shadows across the devastated crater. Through the swirling, fiery boundary of the portal, a completely different world revealed itself. The skies were not choked with the ashes of a burning warship. They were a vibrant, beautiful twilight over the golden city of Wakanda. Marcus stared, his breath catching in his throat, as three figures stepped through the threshold. King T'Challa walked at the center, his vibranium suit absorbing the ambient light, his posture radiating a quiet, absolute authority. Flanking him were Okoye and Shuri, their weapons raised and ready for slaughter. They did not possess the universe-breaking, reality-warping power of the gods who had just abandoned this battlefield. They were entirely mortal, bound by the same laws of physics and death that Marcus was. Yet, as the Wakandan king locked his gaze onto the supercharged, glowing form of the Mad Titan, there was not a single trace of hesitation in his eyes. The sheer, overwhelming relief that washed over Marcus was immediately followed by a chilling spike of dread. These returning heroes had no idea what had transpired here. They had no idea that Thanos had embedded an Infinity Stone directly into his own chest. The single portal was only the beginning. The low, resonant hum of the magic multiplied exponentially, echoing across the pulverized bedrock of the Avengers compound. Dozens, then hundreds of golden rings began to tear open the bruised sky and the smoking earth. The magical boundaries hissed and popped, illuminating the darkest corners of the crater. From the ruins of Kamar Taj, rows of sorcerers marched forward, their hands glowing with intricate rotating mandalas of eldritch light. From the cosmic depths, the massive, jagged ships of the Ravagers broke through the atmospheric portals, their engines screaming as they descended, and from the shattered remnants of Asgard, heavily armored warriors rode forward on winged steeds, their spears catching the golden light. The sheer sensory overload was staggering. Marcus felt the vibrations of 100,000 marching boots echoing through the ground, a rhythmic, thundering heartbeat that completely drowned out the mechanical whining of Thanos' remaining siege engines. It was an army of miracles summoned from the ashes of the snap, pouring into a meat grinder that had just been elevated to an extinction-level threat. In the center of this impossible assembly, Steve Rogers stood completely still. The man who had been ready to face a cosmic warlord alone, armed with nothing but a shattered shield and a broken arm, slowly turned his head. The grime and blood caked on his face could not hide the profound, overwhelming emotion that fractured his stoic expression. The absolute despair that had threatened to consume him only moments ago was entirely washed away by the golden light of the portals. Sam Wilson soared out of the Wakandan gateway, his mechanical wings slicing through the ash, while the massive armored form of Giant Man erupted from the rubble beneath the compound, carrying the surviving heroes who had been trapped underground. Steve Rogers looked back at Thanos. He did not boast. He did not smile. He simply reached down, his fingers trembling with exhaustion, and tightened the broken leather strap of his shattered shield around his bleeding forearm. It was the ultimate defining gesture of human defiance. Marcus watched him, and the final remnants of his own deeply ingrained belief that humanity was nothing but collateral damage crumbled into dust. Thanos did not cower before the overwhelming numbers. The Mad Titan stood at the edge of the molten glass lake created by the Saiyan's blast, his massive body vibrating with the unstable, catastrophic energy of the uncontained Power Stone. The violet light crawled across his purple skin like living, venomous veins, illuminating the absolute madness in his eyes. He had lost his fleet, his vanguard, and his absolute tactical supremacy. But in return, he had bonded with the fundamental destructive force of the universe. He looked at the vast, roaring army of Avengers, Wakandans, and sorcerers, and his scarred face twisted into a terrifying, blood-chilling sneer. He did not see a threat. He saw a concentrated mass of targets. Thanos raised his heavy, double-bladed sword, the massive weapon now glowing with a sickly, pulsating purple aura that warped the air around the steel. He let out a guttural, tectonic roar that physically pushed the smoke away from his body, a sound that challenged the very concept of hope and vibrated directly into the marrow of every soldier standing on the field. The air pressure dropped precipitously as Captain America summoned the mystical hammer, Mjolnir, to his hand. The weapon flew through the smoke, striking his palm with a resonant crack of thunder that momentarily deafened Marcus. Lightning coiled around the super soldier's arm, illuminating the battlefield in a flash of stark, blinding white. The ambient static electricity made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand straight up. Steve Rogers screamed, his voice amplified by the thunder, carrying across the miles of gathered forces. He paused, the entire universe holding its breath in that single, agonizing second. The resulting roar was not a sound, it was a physical force. Hundreds of thousands of voices screamed in perfect unison, a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered human and alien fury. The ground violently shook as the massive army surged forward. It was a chaotic, beautiful collision of colors and sounds. The golden energy of Wakandan spears, the blue repulsor blasts of Rescue's armor, the green, roaring fury of the Hulk. They charged down the slopes of the crater, a tsunami of vengeance rushing directly toward the single, glowing purple singularity at the center of the devastation. The two forces met with a concussive shockwave that threw Marcus hard against the cold armor of Tony Stark. He expected the sheer mass of the Avengers' army to instantly overwhelm the lone Titan. He was catastrophically wrong. As the vanguard of Wakandan rhinos and heavily armored Asgardians reached him, Thanos did not swing his sword. He simply slammed his heavy boot into the ground and violently thrust his chest forward. The Power Stone pulsed with a blinding, sickening flash. A dome of solid violet energy exploded outward from his body, expanding at the speed of sound. The front line of the charging army did not crash into him. They were instantly, brutally vaporized. Vibranium shields, Asgardian steel, and alien flesh were all reduced to a fine purple mist in a fraction of a second. The concussive backwash of the explosion threw King T'Challa and Captain America hundreds of feet into the air, their bodies tumbling like broken dolls. The deafening roar of the charge was instantly silenced by the terrifying mechanical bass drop of the Infinity Stone, claiming its catastrophic toll. Marcus choked on the sudden influx of vaporized ash. The blinding violet light faded, revealing a perfectly smooth, glass-like crater completely devoid of life, a 50-yard dead zone radiating from the Titan's boots. The brutal reality of the universe reasserted itself with sickening clarity. Numbers meant absolutely nothing against a localized god. The heroes were throwing themselves into a cosmic wood chipper. Marcus looked down at his bleeding hands, the steel pipe wrench heavy and cold in his grip. He was a mechanic. He had no armor, no magic, no super soldier serum flowing through his veins. But as he watched a stray, surviving outrider, one that had miraculously escaped Vegeta's subterranean furnace, crawling through the debris toward the unconscious body of Tony Stark, the fear completely evaporated from Marcus's chest. His transformation was absolute. He was no longer a bystander waiting to be saved or crushed. He was the Wall. If the heroes were going to die fighting a god, the least he could do was protect their flanks and ensure their sacrifices were not in vain. The outrider hissed, its 6 limbs tearing through the pulverized concrete. Its multiple black eyes locked onto the glowing arc reactor on Stark's chest. It leaped, its jaws opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp, metal-shredding teeth. Marcus did not scream. He did not close his eyes. He planted his one good leg firmly into the dirt, ignoring the agonizing, blinding pain in his fractured ribs. Using the heavy, lifeless armor of Iron Man as leverage, Marcus swung the heavy steel pipe wrench with every ounce of desperate, terrified strength his human body could generate. The heavy steel connected perfectly with the side of the alien skull. The impact produced a sickening, wet crunch. The kinetic force threw the beast off its trajectory, sending it crashing into a pile of twisted rebar. It thrashed wildly, black blood spraying across the ash, before falling completely still. Marcus fell to his knees, his lungs burning, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the tool. He had killed one monster, but the war raging around him was an escalating tapestry of absolute, incomprehensible violence that threatened to swallow them all. High above the slaughter, Dr. Strange and the masters of the mystic arts attempted to cage the beast. Hundreds of sorcerers synchronized their movements, throwing massive, glowing bands of golden eldritch magic down upon Thanos. The magical chains wrapped around the Titan's arms, his neck, and his heavy boots, pulling taut with the combined strength of Kamar Taj. For a terrifying second, Thanos was restrained. The golden light fought against the pulsating violet energy of the Power Stone. But the stone was not magic. It was the raw, unyielding code of destruction. Thanos let out a deep, booming laugh that vibrated through the earth. He simply flexed his massive arms. The violet energy surged, traveling up the golden chains like a virus. The magical constructs did not just break, they shattered into a million pieces of burning shrapnel. The feedback loop surged back into the sorcerers, violently throwing dozens of them out of the sky. The cost of Vegeta's earlier choice was now excruciatingly clear. As the wounded sorcerers plummeted to the earth, there was no medical bunker left to treat them. They fell into the jagged ruins, their bones breaking against the unyielding reality of the destroyed compound. Thor, bathed in blinding white lightning, plummeted from the sky like a divine meteor, his axe Stormbreaker raised high. At the exact same moment, Captain Marvel tore through the upper atmosphere, a comet of binary thermal energy aiming directly for the Titan's chest. Thanos did not flinch. He dropped his double-bladed sword and raised both of his massive hands. He caught Stormbreaker with his left palm, the blade biting deeply into his flesh, while his right hand met the unstoppable cosmic charge of Captain Marvel. The collision of the three energies, the divine lightning, the binary fire, and the fundamental purple destruction, created a localized singularity. The air within a mile radius was instantly sucked toward the epicenter, pulling Marcus and the debris along the ground. The sky above them completely lost its color, turning a flat, terrifying shade of bruised purple. The gravitational pressure was so immense that the massive Ravager ships hovering in the atmosphere began to violently groan, their massive metallic hulls buckling inward under the invisible, catastrophic weight of the clash. Thanos was completely bleeding, his armor shattering, but the Power Stone was keeping him anchored to reality. Marcus clung to the jagged edge of Stark's armor, his vision swimming with dark spots. As the oxygen was literally pulled from his lungs, the pressure was crushing his skull. He watched in absolute paralyzed horror as Thanos slowly, agonizingly, began to overpower the two strongest beings in the universe. The violet light bleeding from the Titan's chest began to pulse with a rapid, erratic rhythm, like a dying, chaotic star about to go supernova. The horrifying truth locked into Marcus's mind, cold and undeniable. Thanos was not trying to win a melee fight anymore. The warlord realized that his physical body could not sustain the raw, uncontained energy of the Power Stone for much longer. He was going to forcefully detonate it. He was going to unleash a planetary-level extinction wave that would completely unmake the Earth and everyone on it. The permanent loss of their vanguard and the destruction of their medical facilities had left the Avengers completely exhausted and exposed. As the blinding purple light began to swallow the sky, erasing the golden portals and the lightning alike, Marcus realized that the final catastrophic collision of the war was completely unavoidable. The universe was tearing at the seams, and there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The bruised purple sky began to violently collapse inward. The gravitational pull radiating from the center of Thanos' chest was no longer just a physical force. It was a localized, terrifying black hole, tearing at the very fabric of reality. Marcus felt his own blood being pulled toward the surface of his skin, his ears popping repeatedly as the atmospheric pressure dropped to lethal levels. The air tasted of pure, burning ozone and metallic ash, suffocating and heavy. The Mad Titan was going supernova. The combined earth-shattering might of Thor's divine lightning and Captain Marvel's binary fire was slowly, agonizingly being pushed backward by the blinding violet wall of annihilation. Marcus lay draped across the cold, unresponsive armor of Tony Stark. The golden-red suit was entirely dead, caught in a catastrophic system failure from the sheer atmospheric displacement of the Saiyan's earlier blast. Marcus stared at the flickering, dying blue light of Stark's arc reactor. He was just a maintenance engineer. He could not punch a god, he could not cast a spell, and he could not fly. But he knew machines. He knew that when a primary, heavily shielded system locked up under extreme trauma, you had to forcefully, physically bypass the failsafe. Marcus gripped the heavy, blood-stained steel pipe wrench. He didn't hesitate. He raised the heavy tool, ignoring the screaming agony in his ribs, and slammed it directly into the emergency manual override latch, situated just beneath the armored collarbone. The impact produced a sharp, concussive crack that miraculously cut through the roaring, deafening base of the Power Stone. Sparks showered over Marcus's forearms, burning small holes into his uniform. For a terrifying, entirely silent second, nothing happened. Then a violent, high-pitched whine erupted from the intricate circuitry of the suit. The arc reactor flared from a dying ember to a blinding, pristine, furious blue. Tony Stark gasped, his eyes flying open behind the shattered, dirt-caked faceplate. His lungs violently pulled in the ash-choked air, his body immediately convulsing with shock. "He's detonating!" Marcus screamed, his voice completely raw and broken, grabbing the billionaire's heavy armored shoulder with his bleeding hands. "He's going to crack the planet." Stark didn't ask questions. He didn't need a briefing. The genius billionaire took one single look at the apocalyptic purple singularity expanding less than 50 yards away, and instantly understood the catastrophic math. His nanotech reserves were critically depleted, completely incapable of forming weapons, shields, or thrusters. But he didn't need to fly. Stark dug his gauntlets into the shattered bedrock, pulling his heavy, broken body forward with a desperate, animalistic grunt. Marcus did not let go. With his one good leg, the mechanic pushed against the dirt, shoving the armored Avenger forward, offering the absolute last ounce of his mortal human strength to propel the hero straight into the cosmic fire. The heat radiating from the supercharged Titan was entirely unendurable. It blistered Marcus's exposed skin in seconds and melted the heavy rubber grips on his tool belt. Thanos threw his massive head back, his jaws unhinged in a roar of absolute chaotic triumph, preparing to unleash the final crust-shattering shockwave that would unmake the world. But in that crucial, blind fraction of a second, fueled by the desperate push of a broken mechanic, Tony Stark lunged. He didn't aim a punch. He didn't attempt to fire a failing repulsor blast. Stark slammed both of his armored hands directly onto the violently glowing purple-veined chest plate of the Mad Titan. The depleted nanotech of Stark's suit instantly recognized the raw, uncontained energy source. It shifted, flowing like liquid, desperate fire, abandoning its defensive plating to form a localized parasitic conduit. The red and gold metal bit deep into Thanos' flesh, directly grappling with the raw, exposed surface of the Power Stone. Thanos' roar of triumph fractured into a sudden, terrifying scream of absolute panic. The warlord looked down, his eyes wide with disbelief, as the catastrophic violet energy was violently, forcefully siphoned out of his biology and dragged screaming into the fragile, mortal housing of Tony Stark's armor. The transfer of cosmic power was a blinding, agonizing spectacle. The violent violet light drained rapidly from Thanos' veins, instantly replaced by a surging, chaotic storm of purple lightning that crawled up Stark's arms and completely engulfed his right side. The human body was never designed to hold a foundational fragment of creation, let alone wield it. Marcus watched, completely paralyzed by awe and a profound, chilling terror, as the metallic plating of the Iron Man's suit began to melt and fuse directly into Stark's flesh under the impossible thermal and radioactive load. But Tony Stark did not scream. He knelt in the dirt, the absolute pinnacle of human defiance, holding the raw, untamed power of the cosmos in his trembling right hand. Thanos, suddenly stripped of his divine anchor and completely exhausted, stumbled backward. He was a mortal warlord once again, his eyes filled with the cold, undeniable realization of his own imminent end. Stark slowly raised his head, the purple light illuminating the blood, sweat, and absolute resolve on his face. He didn't deliver a long speech. He didn't attempt to snap his fingers. He simply brought his glowing right hand down, slamming his palm flat against the pulverized, bleeding earth. He unleashed the energy not as a bomb, but as a perfectly controlled planetary-scale command of erasure. A silent, blinding flash of pure, inverted white light washed over the entire battlefield. It carried no heat, no concussive force, and no collateral damage. It was simply the absolute, undeniable cosmic erasure of the enemy. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut against the brilliance. When he opened them a moment later, the deafening mechanical roars of the alien siege engines were completely gone. The massive, terrifying Chitauri beasts, the screeching outriders, and the armored Black Order were all silently dissolving into ash, blowing away on a sudden gentle breeze. The bruised, choking purple sky was rapidly clearing, giving way to the pale, fragile, beautiful golden light of a breaking dawn. Thanos, the conqueror of worlds, was slowly turning to gray dust, his massive form scattering into the morning wind, his expression frozen in absolute quiet defeat. The war was over. Marcus sat back in the dirt, his breath trembling in his chest. He looked past the surviving, exhausted heroes who were slowly helping each other to stand. He looked at the smooth, glass-like crater where the medical bunker used to stand. The cost of their survival was permanently burned into the earth, a silent grave for the innocent lives traded by a ruthless god. The dead would not return, and the trauma would never fully wash away. The universe was still a dangerous, terrifyingly vast place. But as Captain America limped over to help a severely burned, yet breathing, Tony Stark to his feet, Marcus let the heavy, blood-stained wrench slip from his fingers. He was just a mechanic. But today he had held the line, and as the warm sunlight finally touched his battered face, he knew that humanity would never just be grass again.